Warsaw, January 1961. A Swedish businessman steps off a train with his father, his head of purchasing, and a young furniture designer in tow. They've come a long way through a Cold War border, past customs officials who have no idea what to make of them for one reason: to buy chairs. Back home in Sweden, almost nobody will sell to them anymore. The man's name is Ingvar Kamprad. He is 34 years old. 7 years earlier, he had been just another name on the Swedish furniture trade's blacklist, an upstart mail-order dealer from a farm nobody had heard of, undercutting established shops so badly that the entire industry decided the cleanest solution was to simply cut him off. No factory would sell him a chair. No supplier would return his calls. Trade fairs, where he'd once rented a stand, quietly stopped inviting him. He is standing in Warsaw because everyone who was supposed to sell him furniture had refused to. At the Polish State Trade Office, an official tells him politely that access to the factories won't be possible. It's the kind of no that's supposed to end a meeting. But one manager, a man named Marian Grabinski, decides to make an exception. The next morning, the group is standing inside a chair factory in a town called Radomsko, watching machines that can make furniture at a price no Swedish factory would dare quote him. This is the moment nobody in the boardrooms back in Stockholm saw coming. The boycott that was supposed to kill Ingvar Kamprad's company was about to hand him something far more dangerous than a discount, an entirely different way of making furniture, unshackled from the people trying to destroy him. Within a few years, that company, a strange little acronym cobbled together from a farm boy's own initials, would be selling more furniture than anyone in Scandinavia. Within 5 decades, it would be the largest furniture retailer on earth. And the man behind it would spend the rest of his life driving a 15-year-old car, flying economy, and pocketing sachets of salt from restaurant tables, all while sitting on one of the largest personal fortunes in the world and carrying a piece of his own history he could never fully put down. This is the story of Ingvar Kamprad and the box that changed how the entire planet furnishes a home. To understand Ingvar Kamprad, you have to understand Småland, a region in southern Sweden that is, by any honest description, a hard place to make a living. The soil is thin and full of rocks. Winters are long. For generations, the people who lived there survived not through abundance, but through resourcefulness, squeezing value out of very little, wasting nothing, improvising everything. There's an old Swedish stereotype about Smålanders, that they're stubborn, thrifty to the point of legend, and endlessly inventive when money is tight. Kamprad would spend his entire life embodying and marketing that stereotype. He was born in March 1926 on a farm called Elmtarid, near a village called Aganarid. His mother, Berta, ran the household with the kind of resourcefulness the region demanded. His father, Fedor, worked the land. But it was his maternal grandfather, Carl Bernhard Nilsson, who probably shaped young Ingvar more than anyone. The old man ran a hardware store that sold a bit of everything, from nails to sweets to actual dynamite, and Ingvar practically grew up behind that counter, treating it as his personal playground. The entrepreneurial instinct showed up absurdly early. At 5 years old, his grandmother helped him import 100 boxes of matches, which he then went door to door selling to neighbors and family at 2 to 3 times what he'd paid for them. By the time he was 7, he was pedaling his bicycle further afield to sell to strangers. He'd figured out, at an age when most children are still learning to tie their shoes, that if you bought matches cheap in bulk from Stockholm and sold them individually at a price still lower than the local shop, you could make a real profit while still undercutting everyone else. He didn't have a word for it yet, but he just discovered the exact same principle that would make him one of the richest men alive. By his early teens, he'd expanded into fish, Christmas decorations, seeds, and pens, and he'd landed on an insight that would define the next 70 years of his life. He noticed the gap between what a factory charged for something and what a customer eventually paid for it in a shop. Pencils that cost almost nothing wholesale were marked up as much as tenfold by the time they reached a customer's hand. Somewhere in that gap sat a chain of middlemen, each one taking a cut. A young Kamprad decided, with the clarity that only a child untrained in how business is supposed to work can have, that this was simply waste. If you could remove the middlemen, you could sell at a fraction of the price and still make money. That single realization cut out everyone standing between the factory and the customer, would become, almost word for word, the operating logic of IKEA. In 1943, at 17 years old, his father gave him a small cash reward for doing well in school. Ingvar used it to register a company. Because he was still a legal minor, he needed a guardian's permission to do it, which he got. On the 28th of July, 1943, a trading company was officially registered under a name built from his own initials plus the first letters of the farm and the village he'd grown up in. Ingvar Kamprad, Elmtarid, Aganarid, IKEA. It would be years before IKEA sold a single piece of furniture. The teenage Kamprad ran his new business the way a teenager runs a business, from home, out of a small shed on the family farm, where he kept packages ready to be picked up each morning by the local milk collection lorry, which doubled as his delivery service. He sold pens, watches, wallets, picture frames, nylon stockings, whatever he could source cheaply and move at a markup lower than anyone else dared. He wasn't loyal to any single category. He was loyal to one thing: finding the most cost-effective path from factory to customer, no matter what the product was. He learned, through relentless trial and error, that the cheapest distribution came from going as close to the source as possible, buying pens directly from the factories that made them, then selling to newsagents, watchmakers, bookstores, and small rural shops. He communicated with customers through simple brochures and price lists, written in a plain, direct, almost disarmingly honest tone that would become an IKEA hallmark decades later. He also did something that mattered just as much as any pricing strategy. He showed up in person. He had an easy, cheerful manner that made it simple for him to walk into a shop as a total stranger and walk out with an order. By 1948, 5 years after registering the company, Kamprad added something new to his catalogue almost as an afterthought: furniture. It sold. Within a few years, it wasn't an afterthought anymore. It was becoming the whole business. There was a practical problem baked into this shift, though. Älmhult, the small town where Kamprad now operated from, sat in a remote corner of southern Sweden, far from the big cities where most of his potential customers lived. Getting furniture in front of people who couldn't just walk into a shop meant solving a distribution puzzle. His answer, in 1951, was the IKEA catalogue, a mailed publication that would eventually become one of the most widely distributed printed documents in the world, reaching more homes annually than most national newspapers. And baked into that first catalogue was a sentence that, in hindsight, reads like a mission statement Kamprad would spend the rest of his life trying to prove true. He asked, essentially, why good design should only be available to people who could already afford it. Why couldn't beautiful, functional furniture be made for everyone, not just the few who could pay a premium? It's the kind of question a lot of people ask rhetorically. Kamprad built an empire trying to actually answer it. Success, it turns out, makes enemies fast, especially when your entire pitch to customers is that everyone else has been overcharging them. By the mid-1950s, IKEA's mail-order prices were undercutting Sweden's established furniture retailers so aggressively that the industry organized against him. Furniture manufacturers, coordinated through their trade association, essentially agreed among themselves: stop selling to Kamprad. Don't let him exhibit at trade fairs. Starve him of supply, and the upstart from Småland goes away. For most companies, that kind of coordinated boycott would have been fatal. You can't sell furniture you can't source. And IKEA at that point still made almost nothing itself. It was a distributor, dependent entirely on manufacturers willing to sell to it. Kamprad's response revealed something about how his mind actually worked under pressure. He didn't lobby the industry to change its mind, and he didn't fold. He rerouted around the blockade. He set up a separate purchasing entity, a company called Econo. specifically so orders could be placed without immediately revealing they were headed to IKEA. He hired a dedicated head of purchasing, a man named Ragnar Sturt, in 1959, and sent him hunting for any supplier in Sweden or outside it, willing to break ranks with the Borchardt. Some suppliers did quietly break ranks, but there weren't enough of them, and Swedish manufacturing capacity alone couldn't keep up with growing demand anyway. So Kamprad looked outward. And in January 1961, that search led him, along with his father, Sturt, and a young designer named Bengt Ruda, onto a train to Warsaw. What happened next was, in the most literal sense, the Borchardt backfiring in spectacular fashion. Poland's furniture manufacturing sector had capacity Sweden's didn't, prices Sweden's couldn't match, and after that one manager decided to unlock the factory doors, a genuine willingness to work with this strange, persistent young Swede. IKEA needed roughly 40,000 dining chairs that year alone. Half of that demand simply couldn't be met domestically. Poland could meet it. Long-term supplier relationships followed, and a country the Borchardt cartel had never thought to worry about became one of IKEA's most important manufacturing bases for years to come. The people who tried to cut Ingvar Kamprad off from Swedish furniture had, without meaning to, pushed him into becoming an international manufacturer years before he otherwise would have needed to. But the Borchardt produced something even more consequential than a new supply chain. Cut off from ready-made furniture designed by other companies, Kamprad had no choice but to start designing IKEA's own. In 1955, the company began developing its own furniture lines for the first time, not because it was part of some grand strategic plan, but because the alternative was having nothing at all to sell. It would turn out to be, in Kamprad's own later description, possibly the best move the company ever made, though at the time, it must have felt a lot more like survival than genius. Every great company origin story seems to need one small, almost accidental moment that in hindsight looks inevitable. IKEA's happened in 1956, and it happened because of a car trunk. Gillis Lundgren was IKEA's fourth employee. He joined a few years earlier as a catalog manager and would go on to become one of the company's most prolific designers, eventually credited with well over 200 furniture pieces, including a bookcase called Billy that would go on to sell in the tens of millions. On this particular day, Lundgren needed to transport a small side table, a design called the Lervit table, to a photo shoot for the catalog. The table, fully assembled, simply wouldn't fit in his car. So he took the legs off. It's easy to tell that detail as a cute anecdote and move on, but the actual insight buried inside it is the entire IKEA business model in miniature. Lundgren didn't just solve his immediate cart trunk problem. He and Kamprad realized that if a table could be transported disassembled, it could also be shipped that way, stored that way, and sold that way. Furniture, until this point, had always been built, then moved as a finished object, bulky, fragile, expensive to ship, and mostly impossible to fit into an ordinary family car. If you flipped that process around and designed furniture from the very beginning to come apart into flat, stackable components, you could compress its shipping volume by an enormous margin. You could stock more of it in less warehouse space. You could let the customer carry it home in their own car instead of paying for delivery. And you could hand the final assembly step, the single most labor-intensive part of furniture making, over to the customer for free in exchange for a lower price. Guinness World Records credits 1956 and Gillis Lundgren as the birthplace of flat-pack furniture. What began as a way to fit a table into a Volvo became the foundation of a global retail category. Every one of the roughly 1 billion IKEA boxes now shipped worldwide each year traces its lineage back to that afternoon. It's worth sitting with the layered irony here for a second. An industry cartel tried to destroy Ingvar Kamprad by cutting off his supply of furniture. That forced him to design his own. Designing his own furniture under pressure to keep costs low and shipping cheap led directly to the flat-pack format. The flat-pack format became the single most defensible, most imitated, most economically brutal advantage IKEA would ever have. His enemies didn't just fail to stop him, they handed him the exact weapon he'd used to conquer them. With his own designs and his own suppliers, Kamprad now needed somewhere for customers to actually see and touch what they were ordering from a catalogue. In 1953, he opened a modest showroom in Älmhult, attached to a workshop, a place where people could walk through room-like displays instead of squinting at black and white catalogue photos and guessing what a sofa might actually look like in their living room. That showroom idea, once tested, got scaled up dramatically. On the 28th of October 1958, IKEA opened what was, at the time, the largest furniture store in Scandinavia, a striking modernist concrete building in Älmhult with dramatic V-shaped support pillars that the press nicknamed victory signs. The county governor showed up. So did the chairman of the local municipal board. So did skeptical journalists from Stockholm, curious to see what this furniture rebel from the countryside had built. What they found was a building organized around a genuinely new idea for the time. Full room settings you could walk through and imagine living in, paired with a self-service warehouse where you could pick up your purchase, flat-packed, and take it home the same day. Kamprad also made a decision at this stage that seems almost unrelated to furniture, but turned out to be strategically brilliant. He put a restaurant inside the store. Hungry, tired customers don't shop well and don't stay long. Fed customers linger, browse more, and buy more. Swedish meatballs, served in an IKEA cafeteria, became such an ingrained part of the shopping experience that decades later people would joke that IKEA was secretly a restaurant chain that happened to also sell furniture. The Älmhult store's success gave Kamprad the confidence, and by 1965, the capital, to attempt something far bigger. That year, IKEA opened a store in Kungens Kurva, just outside Stockholm, on cheap, undeveloped land the company could actually afford. It was, at the time, the largest furniture store in Europe. A circular, almost Guggenheim-like structure designed so visitors would be guided through every department in a continuous path, with parking for the car-driving suburban families the store was built around. The showroom, the self-service warehouse, the restaurant, even a supervised play area for children. The full IKEA format that's now instantly recognizable in more than 60 countries was largely assembled here, out of a combination of hard lessons and educated guesses about what worked. From there, the international expansion followed at a steady, deliberate pace, rather than a reckless sprint. Norway in 1963, Denmark in 1969, Switzerland in 1973, and most significantly, West Germany in 1974, a market that would go on to become IKEA's single largest for decades. Canada followed in 1976, the Netherlands in 1978. The United States, somewhat surprisingly given its size, didn't get its first store until 1985. The UK followed in 1987. Each new country meant relearning local furniture tastes, local building codes, local labor markets, but the underlying formula, refined over 3 decades in rural Sweden, traveled remarkably well. By the mid-1970s, IKEA had grown large enough and spread across enough countries that Kamprad could no longer personally walk the floor of every store and correct every small decision the way he once had. This bothered him. He built a company culture almost entirely through direct, personal contact, chatting with employees, checking how products were displayed, making sure everyone understood not just what to do but why. As the company expanded and Kamprad himself moved further from Älmhult, first to Denmark, later to Switzerland, largely for tax reasons tied to Sweden's restrictive currency regulations at the time, he needed a way to transmit his thinking to people he'd never personally meet. His answer, published in 1976, was a short internal document called The Testament of a Furniture Dealer. It laid out, across 9 sections, what IKEA was actually for and how it was supposed to operate, effectively an attempt to write down a founder's instincts so the company could keep running on them long after he stopped being in the room. A few of its core ideas are worth pulling out, because they explain a great deal about why IKEA succeeded where countless discount furniture chains before and after it did not. Kamprad insisted that the product range was IKEA's identity, that offering a wide, well-designed, affordable range for the entire home was a policy that could never be compromised, no matter how the company grew. He argued that reaching good results with limited means wasn't a constraint to be tolerated, but a skill to actively cultivate, pointing out that almost any designer can design an expensive desk, but it takes real skill to design a good, functional desk that costs a fraction of the price. He described wasting resources, filing paperwork nobody would ever need again, holding meetings just to avoid making a decision, choosing a phone call when a short note would do as something close to a moral failing, not just an inefficiency. There's a phrase attributed to him, describing waste in general terms, that captures the tone of the whole document. He called it one of humanity's great diseases. Whether or not you find that framing dramatic, it's clearly not corporate boilerplate. It's a genuinely held belief, written by someone who grew up on stony Smaland soil where nothing could be wasted, applied at the scale of a multinational company. The testament also pushed back, deliberately, against the idea that growing a company required adopting the trappings of wealth and status. Kamprad wrote that avoiding luxury hotels, flashy cars, and impressive titles wasn't only about controlling costs. It was about signaling to everyone inside the company what kind of organization this was supposed to be. Decades before authenticity became a marketing buzzword, Kamprad had already figured out that his own personal frugality was, itself, one of IKEA's most effective and cheapest advertisements. No honest account of Ingvar Kamprad can skip past one of the darkest chapters of his life, and it would be a disservice to tell this story without it. In 1994, the personal letters of a Swedish fascist politician named Per Engdahl were made public after Engdahl's death. Buried in them was a revelation that would follow Kamprad for the rest of his life. As a teenager, at 16, Kamprad had joined Engdahl's pro-fascist New Swedish movement, reportedly working as a fundraiser and recruiter for the group for several years, active until at least the autumn of 1945, with his friendship with Engdahl continuing well into the 1950s. Sweden's own security police had, in fact, opened a file on the young Kamprad as early as 1943, the exact same year he registered IKEA, labeling it, starkly, a memorandum concerning a Nazi. When the letters surfaced publicly, Kamprad wrote an apology to IKEA's roughly 25,000 employees at the time, describing his wartime involvement with fascism as the greatest mistake of his life. He said he'd severed those ties by the 1950s and called the period something he bitterly regretted. He offered an explanation, too, that his German grandmother had become an admirer of Hitler and that her influence had shaped him during a confused, impressionable adolescence. That might have been where the story ended, if not for a Swedish journalist named Elizabeth Sprink, who spent years investigating further. In archived security service records, she found documentation of Kamprad's formal membership and intercepted wartime letters in which the teenage Kamprad himself wrote about not missing any opportunity to work for the movement. In a 2-hour interview she conducted with Kamprad in 2010, published years later, he was asked, once again, about Per Engdahl. He didn't condemn him. He described Engdahl as a genuinely great man and said it was a view he intended to hold for the rest of his life. That detail matters enormously, and it's worth being precise about why. A young man swept up in a dangerous ideology during a chaotic, frightening period of European history is a story that, while inexcusable, is at least a familiar shape of youthful error. A 90-something-year-old billionaire, decades removed from the war, still privately describing a fascist recruiter as a great man he'd stand by for life. That's a different and much harder thing to reconcile with an apology about youthful folly. Kamprad apologized publicly more than once over more than 2 decades. But the record, as Sprink documented it, suggests that some part of his private loyalty to Engdahl never fully went away, even as his public statements insisted it had. IKEA's own position, stated through spokespeople after these later revelations, was that Kamprad had dedicated his adult life to the company and to the democratic values it stood for, and that events from nearly 70 years earlier had nothing to do with how the business actually operated. That's a defensible institutional position for a company with hundreds of thousands of employees worldwide who had nothing to do with any of this. But it's also, notably, a different question from whether Kamprad himself ever fully reckoned with his own past, and based on what a Sprink documented, that reckoning appears to have been incomplete. It's a genuinely uncomfortable thread to pull on in a story that otherwise reads like an underdog business triumph. But leaving it out would flatten a complicated man into a simple hero, and Kamprad was not that. Set against that darker chapter is the other defining thread of Kamprad's public image, one that IKEA itself would spend decades happily promoting: his almost theatrical personal frugality. By the time of his death, Kamprad's fortune was estimated at somewhere between roughly $42 and $58 billion, depending on which year and which valuation you use. For years, he ranked among the handful of richest people alive on the planet. And yet the stories about him read like they belonged to someone several tax brackets poorer. He drove a 1993 Volvo 240 for roughly 2 decades, reportedly only giving it up after being persuaded it had become unsafe to drive at his age, at which point he switched, somewhat incongruously, to a Porsche. He flew economy class, favored low-cost airlines, and stayed in modest hotels rather than anything luxurious. He was known, and this became something of a running joke in the Swiss village where he lived for decades, for pocketing salt and pepper sachets from restaurant tables, saving wrapping paper to reuse the following Christmas, buying his own gifts in post-holiday sales, and reusing tea bags rather than throwing them out after one use. Locals in Appalachia reportedly nicknamed him, only half affectionately, the miser. Was some of this calculated image management? Almost certainly, at least in part. Kamprad understood, better than most executives of his era, that a founder's personal habits become a company's marketing material, whether he intends it or not. But it wasn't purely performance either. He wrote, in his own testament, that avoiding flashy spending was a form of leadership by example, that if he started living lavishly, it would give everyone beneath him license to do the same, and the whole culture of cost consciousness he'd built would start to erode from the top down. He once put it plainly. He looked at money he was about to spend on himself and asked whether an ordinary IKEA customer could afford the same thing. If the answer was no, he generally didn't spend it. There was a heavier, less marketable side to his personal story too. Kamprad became an alcoholic during his early career, in part through the stress of years spent traveling and negotiating with manufacturers in Poland. He spoke about it candidly later in life, telling reporters in the early 2000s that he got the drinking under control, partly by deliberately drying out a few times a year. It's a detail that rarely makes it into the tidy, frugal genius version of his story, but it's part of the honest picture of a man who built an empire while also, quietly, fighting something that had nothing to do with furniture. And underneath the folksy thrift sat something far less folksy, one of the more elaborate corporate structures ever built around a single company. In 1982, Kamprad established a foundation in the Netherlands, and IKEA's actual operating companies were placed under its ownership, with the structure eventually routed through additional holding entities in Liechtenstein and Luxembourg. On paper, this arrangement meant IKEA was ultimately owned by a charitable foundation rather than by Kamprad personally, a structure the company presented, for years, as reflecting its founders' belief in long-term stability over short-term shareholder pressure. In practice, financial journalists who examined the arrangement, most notably The Economist in a widely cited 2006 analysis, concluded that it also happened to make the foundation one of the wealthiest charitable entities on the planet, while allowing it to disclose very little, pay minimal tax, make the company essentially takeover-proof, and still generate very large ongoing payments to the Kamprad family. Kamprad himself, when pressed by his own authorized biographers about the structure's complexity, reportedly gave an answer that amounted to, "It's simply how it has to be done." Following public criticism after that 2006 analysis, Kamprad went to court in 2009 to formally broaden the foundation's charitable mission to include support for vulnerable children. A shift that, whatever its sincerity, also happened to blunt some of the harshest criticism of an arrangement that had, until then, given remarkably little away relative to its enormous scale. None of this makes the frugality performative or fake, necessarily. But it does complicate the tidy folk hero version of the story. A man who genuinely seemed to believe in personal thrift as a moral good, operating a corporate structure engineered, quite deliberately, to minimize what the empire he controlled ever had to give up. Kamprad married twice. His first marriage, to Kirsten Wadling, ended in divorce in 1960. The couple had adopted a daughter, Annika. In 1963, he married Margaretha Stennert, and the couple had 3 sons, Peter, Jonas, and Matthias, who would each be gradually folded into the business as they grew up, given responsibilities that matched their individual strengths rather than simply handed a title. Peter took on supply chain work. Jonas moved into product design. Matthias, the youngest, moved toward executive leadership. In June 2013, Kamprad formally stepped back, resigning from the board of IKEA Holding. Matthias took over as chairman. It was a quiet, deliberate handover, rather than a dramatic one, consistent, in its own way, with a founder who'd spent decades trying to make sure the company's culture didn't depend on any single person being in the room. Margaretha, his wife of nearly 50 years, had died in 2011. Kamprad, who had lived in Switzerland since the 1970s, moved back to Sweden at the end of 2013, closing a loop that had opened almost 4 decades earlier. He died on the 27th of January, 2018, at his home in Småland, the same region he'd grown up in, 91 years old, following a short illness. IKEA's chief executive at the time, Jesper Brodin, who had worked as Kamprad's assistant early in his own career, described him as someone who'd started with 2 empty pockets and an enormous amount of entrepreneurial drive, someone who genuinely never expected the company to become what it did. Condolences came in from Sweden's royal family, its prime minister, and business leaders across the country, alongside, inevitably, renewed press coverage of the parts of his history that had never fully gone away. Today, IKEA operates roughly 500 stores across more than 60 countries, generating retail sales in the neighborhood of 45 billion euros a year, drawing something close to 900 million store visits annually. It remains, by a wide margin, the largest furniture retailer on the planet, a title it's held for well over a decade. The Billy bookcase that Gillies Lundgren sketched on the back of a napkin in 1979 has sold well over 140 million units, making it, quite plausibly, one of the most owned pieces of furniture in human history. What's genuinely remarkable, when you step back from the individual milestones, isn't any single decision Kamprad made. It's how consistently the same handful of instincts kept resurfacing at every scale of the business, from a teenager selling matches off a bicycle to a multinational company shipping 1 billion flat boxes a year. Cut out the middleman. Design for the lowest possible cost without sacrificing function. Treat waste as close to a sin. Let the customer do part of the work in exchange for a lower price. Never let comfort at the top erode discipline further down. Those instincts built one of the most durable retail formats of the last century. They also, it's worth remembering, coexisted in the very same man with a documented history of fascist sympathy he never fully disowned, and a corporate structure engineered as much to protect wealth as to protect a mission. There's a temptation, in stories like this one, to resolve every founder into either a hero or a villain, to make the story cleaner than the life actually was. Ingvar Kamprad doesn't resolve cleanly. He was a farm boy who genuinely believed good design shouldn't be a luxury, and he built a company around that belief with a level of discipline that outlasted him by decades. He was also a man whose adolescent political sympathies followed him into old age in ways he never seemed able, or perhaps never fully chose, to close the book on. Maybe that's the more honest lesson to take from a story like this, that the same relentless, uncompromising discipline that makes someone capable of building something as large as IKEA rarely arrives in a person cleanly separated from their flaws. Kamprad spent 75 years refusing to waste a single krona. He spent considerably less of that time fully reckoning with the parts of his past that couldn't simply be repackaged in flat cardboard and shipped out the door. The box he built is still, right now, sitting in the back of someone's car on the way home, waiting to be assembled.